that 90% of the people that I come into contact with are really pro-peace, and peace is what they want. Then why is it if 90% of the people really want to live in peace, why don't we live in peace? 10% of the bad people have a greater influence than the 90%. And in some ways that is the case. Our problem is not so much the people become supportive of war or promote the war. Too many of them are very apathetic and complacent, and they go along. But the big problem is that the people, the citizens, the people who suffer from the war don't start the war. The real problem is that we have to understand it's the government and government policies that causes the war, and that's what we have to restrain. So I think what happens, governments have been around for a long time, is that people who have psychopathic personalities and aggressive personalities and enjoy telling other people how to live, whether it's in a social sense, economic sense, or in a military sense, they like power, and there's an opening, and people the people themselves don't have a resistance, and governments tend to have, over the centuries, always assumed a lot more power. And this just opens up the door for the people who want power, and even those who go with good intentions to Washington, they are consumed with this attitude, and before you know it, they're part of the system. There have been so many individuals that I've seen over the years who had very good intentions about going to Washington, and they believe basically like we do, but they didn't maintain that position. They're not like the few that stick to their principles. So they go, and then they're influenced, and all of a sudden, the whole system is political. For them to do good and promote our views, they have to be in a position of power and influence in Washington. So they succumb to become more moderate and say, well, I have to give in. The one term I don't like is moderation in politics, because I think that is a sacrifice of principles. What I like to think about in politics, as far as making corrections, because there's so much imperfections, is to work with coalitions. And that is, there are a lot of people that might not be true libertarians, but they have a set of principles that they'd like to see a lot less killing and a lot less war. And there's no reason in the world we can't be talking, as I do, to the Dennis Kuciniches of the world and others who will stand up, for peace. And this to me, I think, is real the answer. Moderates, when they come together, they have to sacrifice what they believe in. Let's say you have a liberal in the negative sense and conservatives in the negative sense, but each having some positive things, and they come together, but they have to give up their beliefs. So they sacrifice their true convictions. Now, when I think of the relationship I've had with Dennis Kucinich, we never ask each other to sacrifice anything. We ignore the things that we disagree with, and we come together on the issues that we do agree with, and we work in that capacity. But that helps a little bit. But why is it that we still keep losing the battle? Well, the one thing is I am convinced the libertarian principle can solve a lot of problems. If we would adapt to the principle of non-aggression, not initiating any force against each other, and we had people really accept this, it can solve so many problems: social problems, economic problems, peace problems, and everything else. But if we do that, the big problem is, as soon as they get into government, the government doesn't have to obey the same rules. And we can't, with the libertarian principle, although I have such strong positive feelings about this principle, that one thing it can't solve is the problem of good and evil. Adam said that, the founders have given you a a republic if you can keep it. And he said that the moral standings of the people will make the difference. When the people become immoral, the system just doesn't work. And yet, at the same time, if the people who are immoral, the problem is they get in government. So our job is first, if we can't solve the problem of good and evil, but some people call me naive because I'm too optimistic about how people should act if they would just accept a few principles. But I think good and evil is going to exist, and the evil people are going to be out there. So the big challenge for us is, of course, to keep the evil people out of government. That's where the problem comes from. But I think the founders tried to do that. They tried to set up the rules, and yet there's always this temptation, the temptation of power corrupting. And they get in office and they give in and they move over and they sacrifice. And so I think the founders basically failed. If they had been successful, our Constitution would be a much more powerful instrument. And it didn't take a long time to have some early erosion. As a matter of fact, I think Jefferson realized that early on, that there was an erosion. And even those who said be careful about the Constitutional Convention and cautious about opening up the door to the growth of government. And that has happened. So the individuals, sacrifice too much and allow governments to do this. So how are we, if people were alert, we would only send the very good people who would not be tempted to do bad things in Washington. We wouldn't send the bad people, and we wouldn't send people who would succumb to the temptation. But that doesn't seem to have worked as well. So it's back to the problem of how do we limit the government? I think the key to it is to have a set of rules that are more binding, but it has to be supported by the people. What should the role of government be? And that is the question. I think the founders asked that, and they tried to redefine it. But I think we have to ask that question and try to define what should the role of government be. I have a very complicated answer to what the role of government ought to be. The role of government and the purpose of government should be to protect liberty. That's it. And that's what our goal should be. So, of course, what would be the step there? Well, we have to repeal 87%. I just picked that out of the air. 87% of what our federal government does, because you wouldn't need all this stuff, because what government does, whether it's economic intervention, running monetary policy, regulatory things that are always supposed to help the people and take care of the consumers, or a foreign policy and making the world safe for democracy and spread American exceptionalism, that can't work. You have to have a system where the government is strictly limited. What would it mean? It would mean that, first off, we should be able to absolutely have a position in a country like ours that a very powerful right, and I put it in quotes, an ability for the organizations such as the states that are put together for our country, they should always have the right to secede. Now, does that mean we have to be for secession and every state has to leave? Well, right now it'd be hard for me to deny anybody's right to leave, but you don't have to. It's just the right to secede that is so important. That would hold the federal government in check. The government would have to be careful. But even if they just had nullification, which was a strong issue of Jefferson, just so we as a people and the local people and local governments, the state governments, if you didn't like what the feds were doing, and if they're violating the Constitution, that you ought to be able to opt out and nullify it. And that would hold a big check on the federal government as well. And the neat part about this is it's coming, because we are going to have chaos. We're going to have economic chaos. We're going to have the political fallout of our foreign interventionism. The world will turn against us, and we are going to have an opportunity for a lot of nullification. It's already starting. I think it's fantastic that the issue of the ridiculous war on drugs is coming to an end, because the states and the people are nullifying these laws and they're saying, stay away. I hope that doesn't get reversed with this administration, but at least we're making progress there, and I think that is great.